of storylines. So the Europeans tried very hard to tell Indians that, look, you have no science, you have had some music and some dance and some some
Ritual.
religion, ritual, and all that, but really all those things are not scientific. Science is from us, so please be our disciples. And then at some point, Indians followed it. But in reality, India was
This is where it gets interesting. When you get into one of your papers, you talk about the consciousness with the small c and the consciousness with the big C. All that the mind and the intellect that was illuminated by the prakasha, this the one that illuminates is the big C consciousness. The one that gets illuminated is the small c consciousness.
very true, very true, very nicely said, very nicely said. At St. Petersburg, there was a lot of Sanskrit being done at that time. So he knew about what was going on. And he knew that the Sanskrit Varnamala is a two-dimensional table. And that was the clinching idea. It's a two-dimensional table. How do you put the elements that you have, the chemical elements, in a form so that
Welcome back to this another podcast on topics related to mind, body, and beyond, where we talk to remarkable people on various fields of science and technology and medicine and consciousness and so on. Today we have Dr. Subhash Kak. He's an eminent, remarkable person that we have with us. A brief introduction: Dr. Kak is a professor, a computer science professor at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater. He has written extensively in the fields of quantum mechanics, neural networks on one side, and on the other side, he also had produced enormous amount of work in Indian knowledge systems, in astronomy, Indian astronomy, yoga, and many other, like Kannada, Vaisheshika Sutras of Kannada. He has translated the Kannada Sutras, numerous books, about 20 books, and hundreds of papers in peer-reviewed journals. He's also part of Indian Prime Minister's Scientific Advisory Committee, and he is a recipient of numerous awards, and most prominently Padma Shri in 2019. Welcome, Dr. Subhash Kak.
Thank you, Rajeev. Delighted to be a part of your podcast series.
Yeah, great. So I read some of the papers that you have written. There are some that caught my attention, the ones that I'm interested in. See, I'm a medical doctor. I have done a master's in Sanskrit. And part of that is exposure to these Indian knowledge systems. Being part of the Prime Minister's Scientific Advisory Committee, I would like your opinion or your experiences on Indian knowledge systems. Let me give you some perspective on what I mean by that. If you ask any average Indian, people who are born in India, raised there, got educated in India, ordinary, extraordinary, whatever, India, tell me something about your philosophies that originated in India. Is there any critical thinking in Indian knowledge systems? And they're at a loss of words. But you ask them about Greek philosophy, Socrates, Aristotle, what have you, and they immediately jump with a lot of knowledge, a lot of information on that. Where did we go wrong in providing Indian knowledge systems into our? I grew up in India, you grew up in India. Where did we go wrong?
Well, I think what happened was that in 1947, when we became independent, India was already very poor, and India had become impoverished during the 150 years of complete British rule. According to economists, India's share of the world economy in 1800 was about 20%. And by 1918, by the end of the First World War, it had shrunk to 1.8% of the world economy. And then after the First World War, there were some attempts made by the British to encourage Indians to set up some factories and so on. So it climbed up into maybe the 2% by the time they left. So during the 150 years of the British rule, not by actual slaughtering of people, but by their policies, and especially by deciding not to invest in India when the Industrial Revolution was taking place in Britain and in Europe, what they did was to make India the marketplace for their products, which completely devastated India's economy. And there are estimates that the British, by their policies, stole about $45 trillion from India and caused 100 million deaths in many famines that occurred in India. In fact, a phrase that's been used for what happened in India is late Victorian Holocaust, that so many people during Queen Victoria's rule, the late 19th century, took place, these deaths took place because of the famines that were precipitated by British policies. Okay, so all this had happened. India's education system was totally dismantled by the British. The Indian education system was not the greatest, but it was fairly effective. It's been estimated that the literacy rate before the coming of the British was about 60 to 70%. Every people from all jatis went to these pathshalas. It's not that it was confined only to one jati or the other. By the time they left, the literacy rate had dropped to 6 or 7%. So India's self-image was extremely low in 1947. And the socialists who took over power wanted to follow the model of the Soviet Union, that let's forget about the past, let's just industrialize, let's just do science. And besides not knowing history that well, because many of these facts have come out of the researches in the last 40 or 50 years, they thought that all the problems that India had were to be laid at the doorstep of the Indian approach to the world. Indian approach to reality was too otherworldly, and perhaps what the British had been telling us, that we had no science, was true, that our society was too stratified, it was too hierarchical. So let's not waste our time on our own scientific heritage, because maybe we don't have any scientific heritage. And therefore, let's just look at India through the eyes of the Europeans. And if Europeans teach Greek sciences, so let's also teach Greek sciences, or the predecessor to modern sciences, to the extent we can find it in Greek sciences. So this is what happened. So our education system, especially from 1947, prior to that, that wasn't the case. There were some great scientists who were raised within India's own milieu. You know, you have people like C.V. Raman or J.C. Bose. There was another S.N. Bose, and many others who were also connected to India's own tradition. People until 47, whatever education that they obtained, they were historians writing about India's past. But after 47, there's a full stop. So about 4 generations of Indians have grown up without a proper estimate of their own past. Now, of course, some people in India said that our past is probably going to be problematic because it's contested. There are various groups who look at our past differently. So why even worry about it? Let's only look at the present and the future, which in reality, as we know, from a psychological point of view, from the point of view that in order to change the world or change the future, you must have total self-confidence, not faked, not made up self-confidence, but you should have a fair idea of what the past was, you know what the past is, you know where you are, so you'll be able to negotiate through the future. So we didn't do that for a long time, but that is changing. India's share of the world economy has climbed to maybe 5 or 6%. We are already the world's third largest economy on a purchasing power parity, PPP basis. And Indians are everywhere. Indians are the most successful community in the United States. So people are asking, if the diaspora Indians can be so successful, why can't India be also as successful? And I think that is making for a great psychological change. And at the same time, the shortcomings of the West are becoming apparent. The West itself is facing a crisis of huge proportions, not only economically, but also its own sense of where it's going. And we can see signs of that in the cancel culture that we have in American universities. Kind of a closing of the American mind is taking place. And right now, there is a focus on maybe using the fortunate situation that America is in, that the dollar is the reserve currency. But should that change, then perhaps America's situation might not be as good as it is now. But anyway, to the specific question that you asked, these were certain decisions, deliberate decisions that were taken in 1947 against the views of some of the wise people there at that time, like Rajgopalachari or C.V. Raman himself and many others. They said, well, going like this is not the best way to do. But for many years in India, there was some kind of a one-party rule, and the socialists of the left pushed ahead regardless. So here we are.
Yeah. So the way I see it as not just a holocaust of people, but the intellectual holocaust, like just resetting, just erase the past, complete erase the past intellectually. That you have no knowledge systems, you have no heritage intellectually. I mean, when you talk to Indian, what are you proud of? All they talk about is festivals, yoga, pujas, things like meditation, Ramana Maharshi, and which is very relevant, which is very important, because they are the things that are being exported now and spread to the world. But when you actually talk about your Mimamsa, talk about your Tarka or logic, talk about, of course, Vedanta, because of Vivekananda and so on, is now spread, and that too, one version of Vedanta, of course, has spread to the world, the rest of the world. Is it because of eliminating Sanskrit as part of a curriculum because when I was growing up, I took some Sanskrit courses in my 11th and 12th, and just to pass the exam, because you get higher grades if you take Sanskrit, and nothing sunk in, zero. I mean, almost. Maybe there is some seed of Sanskrit in me, which made me pick it up when I reached 40 or so. But literally, the pedagogical experience was nothing but, hey, here is some vibhaktis, here is some, you just memorize them, write some sentences in it. Has language has something to do in either elimination or revival of the Indian knowledge systems?
Sanskrit certainly is a very important element of the story, because the Europeans, when they began to dominate India, part of their struggle was to put Indian knowledge system or Indian view of the world down, because they wanted, what is domination? Domination is you accept the storyline of the hegemon, of the ruler. Everybody is a storyline. We have personal storylines in each family and communities of storylines. Sometimes you call them myths, or nations of storylines. So the Europeans tried very hard to tell Indians that, look, you have no science. You have had some music and some dance and some religion, ritual and all that. But really, all those things are not scientific. Science is from us, so please be our disciples. And then at some point, Indians followed it. But in reality, India was the leading scientific nation until just 2 or 3 centuries ago. It was the leading scientific nation in all fields. Now, just to give you a couple of examples, the scientific revolution is supposed to have taken off with Newton and Leibniz in the late 1600s or early 1700s, and the real stimulus for this scientific revolution was the invention of calculus and infinite series. Now it's been revealed that infinite series and calculus was invented in India 3 centuries prior to its invention in Europe. In a place in Kerala, it's called now the Kerala School of Mathematics and Astronomy. It was the most advanced scientific situation anywhere. And now there are some people who are even suggesting that at that time, the 16th century and so on, the Jesuits were already present in India when the Kerala School was at its height. And some people have suggested that maybe the Jesuits who were from Rome, who had been sent to various countries to gather whatever information they could get, were responsible for taking all these developments back to Europe. And it took Europe some time to digest it. Because as a parallel, we do know that when the Indian numeral system reached via the Maghreb meaning Morocco and Algiers, through somebody called Fibonacci. He was an Italian. He had learned the 10-digit Indian numeral system, which is sometimes also called the Arabic numeral system because it came to Europe via the Arabs. So it was an Arabic book that was taken by Fibonacci, and the church opposed the Indian numeral system for 2 centuries. They said this is satanic because how can you have negative number systems? Because, you know, the moment you have the whole numeral system as it evolved, Brahmagupta in the 6th century or the great Bhaskaracharya, etc., had positive numbers, negative numbers, you can do various things, just as we do now. But the church fought it for 200 years, but ultimately triumphed. Likewise, the argument has been made that the calculus, while it went from here earlier on, but it took Europeans some time to take it. And once they adopted it, that created the scientific revolution. But, you know, it's not just this. You look at the foundation of computers, mathematical logic, occurred in 1840s, 1850s in England. There were 3 Englishmen, Auguste de Morgan, George Boole, and Charles Babbage. And so they're given credit. If you do computer science, you'll find their names all over, you know, the Morgan diagrams, Boolean algebra, and so on. Now, George Boole's widow, George Boole died, I believe, in the 1860s. George Boole's widow in the 1890s wrote a very famous essay. She was a science writer of her famous one in her own times. She said, look, isn't it amazing that Indians are not being given credit for all this work? Because the teacher of these 3, or mentor really, was George Everest, who was the Surveyor General of India, who would go back to London from time to time, and he would tell them about this amazing, since you mentioned Tarka in the beginning, amazing Navya Nyaya Shastra, which he had learned, which Pandits had taught him in India, which now is believed to be exactly equivalent to mathematical logic. So this invention of mathematical logic in the 1840s and 1850s only reinvented mathematical logic, which was a part of Navya Nyaya, which was created in Bihar and Bengal from 800 AD onwards. So that is one. So that is, yeah, absolutely. And that's created the computer revolution, right? And all that. But the other part of the modern revolution, which has changed society completely, is quantum mechanics. And we know that the inventor of quantum mechanics in the 1920s was an Austrian Vedantin named Erwin Schrödinger, who in his own autobiography claims that the central idea of quantum mechanics came to him from the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma. that this Atman within one is in some mysterious ways equivalent to the entire Brahman, entire cosmos. And this gave him the central idea that, that in the quantum state, the micro state of a particle is a superposition of all possibilities, even though they are mutually exclusive. There are two bases to quantum mechanics. I'm going to teach you quantum mechanics in,
Please do.
minutes.
Please do.
In 2 minutes. The first element is that the quantum state is a superposition of all possibilities. The second element is also from Vedanta, which is that when you interact with reality, you get access to only one of the possibilities. And so what happens in quantum mechanics is that when you look into the quantum particle or quantum wave, you get only one of those possibilities that the wave is superimposed of or consisting of. And this is the dichotomy that we have as a part of Vedanta and yoga, that you have reality, which is para, right? But our language is apara. So para is beyond space and time. So that's why everything is included in it simultaneously. But apara is distributed. Para is one. There is one Shiva, Shivoham, right? But minds are many because minds are instrumented. Our minds are antaha karan, right? They are inner instruments. So both these elements of quantum mechanics are really part of the Vedanta Yoga Vaisheshika complex, which have, of course, been mathematically enlarged in many different ways. But people who do history of science concede that the way quantum mechanics has arisen is absolutely consistent with Vedanta. So Indians didn't know it. Indians don't know all of these things. They're not even told these storylines that look.
Even now.
But fortunately, this morning, I received a copy of my most recent book. It's called The Idea of India. And it's just published this week. And I do have all these little stories written in it. The Idea of India. Yeah.
I'll leave the link in the description below. But let me dwell on that two concepts that you mentioned a little bit, because I think this is pretty profound. When you say superposition of possibilities, do you mean the womb of possibilities, where from that state all things emerge? Is that what it means?
Yes, it does. See, for example, in the terrestrial world, in our normal world, things are distinct. The shoes that you're wearing will either be black or brown or red or whatever, or white or whatever else color they might have. In this womb of possibilities, before they emerge in the embodied world, the quantum state consists of all these colors at the same time. And then when you interact with it, you get one of those. Likewise,
Is it similar to Hiranyagarbha, or the Pradhana of Sankhyas talk about Pradhana, Purusha and Prakriti, Prakriti in its manifest form, Prakriti in its unmanifest form. When there is some kind of, by the will of the Purusha, there is a disturbance in the unmanifest form, then there is this manifestation called Prakriti. But Prakriti in its unmanifest is the Pradhana.
Rajeev, you put it beautifully. I wish I had used one of these, this is really the heart of it. In its unmanifest form, which is where we are looking at the quantum state, that is one way Prakriti shows her form to us. All these possibilities exist. But when Purush and Prakriti interact, then you get access to one of those. In Purush can also be viewed, or Shiva can be viewed as Prakasha. When this Prakasha falls into your mind, there is that Vimarsha. Vimarsha is the reflection, if you will, Bimba and Pratibimba, the reflection within the architecture of your mind of the light that is received, and then what you receive can be only one of those possibilities. This, Rajeev, you and I have expressed all of quantum mechanics in the most compact form it is possible to do.
That's amazing. That's what Shiva Sutras talk about, Chaitanyam Atma. So Chaitanyam, which is Prakasha, I guess, Chaitanyam or Chittam, the Prakasha. So this is where it gets interesting. When you get into one of your papers, you talk about the consciousness with a small c and the consciousness with a big C. All that the mind and the intellect that was illuminated by the Prakasha, the one that illuminates is the big C consciousness. The one that gets illuminated is the small c consciousness.
Very true, very true, very nicely said, very nicely said. And the background to the story is that DARPA 5-6 years ago wanted some people in the US, some
What is DARPA?
DARPA, defense.
DARPA.
Defense.
Oh yeah, okay. US defense.
Yeah, this is the highest research body which gets money straight from DoD for doing future research to set the tone for where science should go. And in fact, DARPA is the one that funded the invention of the internet in the late 1960s and 70s, the very initial steps. It was the Ethernet in the beginning. So DARPA 5-6 years ago funded a project which they channeled through SRI, which is Stanford Research Institute. They didn't want the world to know that DARPA was doing it. And the task that was given in this project was, will computers in the future become conscious? Not necessarily 10 years from now, maybe 100 years from now, or 1,000 years from now. And so there were 20, 30 scientists. I was one of them, and there were some physicists and neuroscientists, some physicians, some philosophers, and a lot of program managers from DoD and NSF and others. And we had many meetings. In fact, there were 11 week-long workshops, morning to night. And
how long ago?
This was 2016 or 2017.
Oh, recent.
Yeah, and one of them was outside US in Cambridge, UK, and I was there. And there was one also in the Bay Area. I was there too. I didn't attend all of them because, one couldn't fit them into one's schedule, all of them, morning to night. And the conclusion was there were some people who only do computers, and generally people who do computers don't really have a proper understanding of the world. Because they think that everything is machine-like, mechanical, everything is zeros and ones. That's not what reality is. Reality is much more complex than that. But most people who did neuroscience or physics were sure that computers will never be conscious, because computers only implement a mathematical program. A hardware is equivalent to software. Hardware is an implementation of software. Software is nothing but math. And consciousness cannot arise in math. Math is only equations. Math is only logic, right? So there is more to consciousness than just what happens in a computer. Now, if you look at the brain as a machine, and it's also legitimate to look at the brain as a machine, especially if you're a doctor. If you're a neurosurgeon, that's the way you should do, because as a scientist, you can only use linguistic descriptions for whatever you're doing. So that's perfectly legitimate. But while that is true, but there is something to the way the brain works, because the brain doesn't implement a program. The brain or living systems adapt to their environment. They are ecological systems. Computers are not ecological systems. Computers only implement mathematical equations or programs. In fact, this also, since you're a physician, and incidentally, both my children are physicians too, but since you're a physician, the crisis of modern medicine, of allopathy, is this, because allopathy looks at the body as a machine and to try to treat symptoms.
Its parts.
Yeah, while Ayurveda in reality is more advanced, because Ayurveda looks at the body as an ecological system. It's looking for harmony and balance and well-being. That's what medicine should be all about. But that's a separate point. But in any event, these meetings took place in 2016, and so the whole idea was that if you look at what happens in the brain and the activity in the brain and the mind, that is little c, and that's really the light of prakasha falling into the mind, and big C is, if one were to sort of go the full way and say, that is Maheshwara, that Bhagavad Gita, that Krishna says that within you, Atma has the form of Maheshwara, right? And which in the Shaivite tradition is Shiva or Maheshwara once again. So Shiva is that light, is that prakasha, which illuminates our mind. And big C is this transcendent reality, this para, and little c is this apara. And there are a billion different minds, right? Because each one of the apara is determined by our autobiographical memory, our storylines, the kind of avarans we have on the, stopping the light falling into us, right? And how afraid we are, how attached we are to our pashu nature, because we are also pashu. If you are, then there's more darkness. Then you feel sorry for yourself. You feel a victim. You feel you're helpless, and then you do actually become helpless, right? And that, in fact, can also explain what's happening in society. Why there are certain groups which tend not to be successful, because they are too attached to their little c. And all of Sanatana Dharma then is a way of taking flight from little c and soaring into the sky and catch on to this light and be a part of this light.
Yeah. So all the neuroscience or the consciousness studies that we do or they do in the Western hemisphere or wherever is focused on this little c consciousness, right? So when I talk to my patients and say consciousness versus unconscious, I'm talking about an agent within the subjective experience who is able to look out and say the right things. The right things. In other words, the convention, the construct, the conventional construct that says like he's alert, he's oriented to time, space, and he's got intact memory, he can recognize people and things like that. That is the consciousness studies that we do. But according to Vedanta, it's not just Vedanta. I think we should go beyond Vedanta, because whenever we talk about Indian knowledge systems, everybody tends to think it's only Vedanta. There is Tarka, there is Mimamsa, there is Vaisheshika, Nyaya, Navya Nyaya. There is Sankhya. Sankhya is beautiful. I feel that they are the oldest skeptics, the evolutionary thinkers or skeptics. So you say in one of your papers that consciousness is not computable, that big C consciousness. So, but for us, or for the people who are exposed to Indian knowledge systems, you take it as a pramana. Aptavakya or Shruti Vakya is a pramana. You take it and say you accept it. But how do you go to a Western scientist and say, hey, here is the potential? Is that where the quantum mechanics comes and says, these are the possibilities, what you took for granted as little c, there is a substratum behind it. There is a womb of possibilities. That is that Hiranyagarbha that we talk about. How do you explain it to a Western scientist who is closed to that idea that we are little bubbles of consciousness separated from this nature, whereas Ayurveda talks about you, because it is based on Sankhya and yoga and other things, there is this concept of you are a product of nature, and therefore you are not separate from it. What happens in nature reflects into you, that microcosm versus macrocosm. So when you go to the scientists, you talk to them, how do they, when you explain your ideas to them or when they read your books, what is that you get? How do they respond to it?
Indian ideas, or Vedic ideas or Vedantic ideas. Vedanta is, of course, you have six darshanas. Five darshanas are related to analysis. Vedanta and yoga is, of course, where it's all put together. But Vedanta, meaning the end of the Vedic understanding or intuition. So Vedanta, I'm using it as a big basket to include all the stuff that we have from India. Well, Vedanta is hangs together in such a beautiful way that if you speak about it to any open-minded person, no matter from what culture, they will say, yes, it does hang together. Because what is Vedanta all about? Okay, first of all, if you were to ask me in one line, to ask me to define Vedas or Vedanta in one line, I would say, according to Vedanta, reality has two aspects. One is Atma, the other is embodiments, consciousness and physical universe. Now, incidentally, in quantum mechanics also, in the orthodox interpretation, consciousness is supposed to be complementary to physical universe. Exactly the same, because I told you the history of that. It was really taken by people who knew how Vedanta looked at reality. Okay, so it's really just that. You have consciousness on the one hand and the physical universe on the other hand, which is an embodiment of the consciousness. Now, you were to ask people, how can you explain, how can you and I, if we had only little c, even be able to understand each other? Because our stories are so different. Our personal stories are so different. And then you might say, well, there are certain archetypes. You might go to Jung and Freud, although Jung himself was much inspired by Indian ideas, archetypes and so on. And that's what you have, the unconscious, and maybe there's some fundamental structures in our unconscious, which is why we are able to understand each other. But then the question would be, how do you explain the personal story of somebody like Srinivasa Ramanujan, who would wake up in the morning and say and write these complicated equations, which he could not explain. And he would say that goddess Namagiri dictated these equations to him in his lucid dreams. And they are still working. He's been dead for 100 years, almost, and they're still working on those notebooks, and they are still yielding absolute gems. So where does this come from? Or forget that. Look at any creative person. Creativity does not come out of inductive generalization. Creativity comes out of outside of the box.
What is inductive generalization?
Inductive means you look at a lot of data and then you say, okay, if we were to push it in this direction, and here is the generalization. You know, like the sun rises every morning, so therefore the sun sets, it's got a period of this kind.
Like how the current AI does, the generative AI does, something
Absolutely.
similar. It gets all the data and then summarizes it.
Right, but it cannot be creative. For creativity, you have to go outside the box. Or I can give you a personal example. 30 years ago, I was reading the New Yorker magazine in my home in Baton Rouge. We used to live there then. And there was an essay by John Updike on the last page of the New Yorker. And it spoke about how the size of the sun and the moon, looking at them from the earth, is about the same, which is why you have eclipses. The moment I read it, something clicked in me, and I was certain that this fact had something to do with the very organization of the Rig Veda. And I rushed to my library, and in just a few minutes, I discovered an organization of the Rig Veda, which had been lost for 2,000 years. And I was able to discover, for example, that the Vedic rishis were aware that both the sun and the moon were each 108 times their respective diameter from the earth. Did you know that? This is true. Modern astronomy tells us. And modern astronomy also says that the diameter of the sun is about 108 times the diameter of the earth. And since you alluded to macro-micro equivalence, which is yat pinde tad brahmande, as in the cell, so in the cosmos, so the ritual related to 108 names of the goddess or the god, or the Japamala 108 beads, is making a symbolic journey from earth, which is your Annamaya Kosha, which is your body, to the sun within, the lamp of consciousness within, which is your Atma. And just as the outer cosmos, you have the earth, you have the atmosphere, then you have the sun. So these two were viewed in some kind of a mirroring arrangement. So there is all this creativity, and not just in the sciences, in all fields, in the arts and dances. As doctors, you get a new idea. It comes from outside of the mind, the little C. And now, since you did mention the Sankhya tattvas, the tattvas that you have, of course, you have pradhan and buddhi and ahankar and all.
Jnanendriya, karmendriya,
Yeah,
antakarana.
and then you have the tanmatras, right? Now, the tanmatras and the bhutas, they are there's a famous dialogue in the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad between Gargi and Yajnavalkya, where Yajnavalkya tells Gargi that the the bhutas are oth-prot in each other. They are entangled with each other. It's not that the Prithvi Mahabhut is totally distinct from the Apas Mahabhut, or from the Tejas, or from the Vayu, or from the Akasha. That they are actually totally connected, entangled. But of course, they are a sequence. And in fact, when I translated the Vaisheshika Sutras about 7 years ago, I was astonished how not only did Kanada, writing maybe 2,500 years ago, anticipate the laws of motion of Newton's. He had, in fact, the same phrase for the third law of motion, which is to every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Kanada says, Karya Virodhi Karma. Karya meaning action, Virodhi is opposed by, karma is reaction. So amazing. And not only that, Kanada even says that all properties that you have of reality, of outside reality, are to be inferred from dravyas, their gunas, and their karma, meaning substances, their characteristics, their properties, and their motions. Every scientist would agree with it. There's nothing in the Vedic texts, in the yogic texts that I've studied and I've written on very extensively on history of science journals. There's nothing which, if you are able to explain in a systematic way, a Western open-minded scholar will not accept. So it's just a question of bringing them to light.
Yeah, I'm writing a book on the philosophies of India, the 6 classical philosophies of India. After that, I had to spend a bit of time on the Vaisheshika Sutras and the Kanada's concepts. He talks about the Anu, which they loosely translate to atom. And he talks about how 2 atoms combine together to form 3 and then 4 and then continue. So I was just amazed by how they are able to conceptualize without any aids of, maybe they had tools, maybe they don't. We don't know. At that time, but maybe their mind is the antakarana is their tool that they used. This is talking about the Srinivas Ramanujan. So I recently had such a podcast with Paul Kiparsky. He's a linguist based in the University of California. When I reached out to Noam Chomsky that I wanted to talk about Paninian grammar, he referred me to Paul Kiparsky, Paul mentioned something very interesting on these grounds. He said Mendeleev, Mendelian, that periodic table, how he conceived the periodic table in his dream, and when he woke up, he wrote it down, whatever he saw in his dream, and he was reading Paninian grammar all the time when he was thinking about a periodic table. Paul Kiparsky is of the opinion that Paninian system was the foundation behind the periodic table's conception, the way it was created, because Mendeleev was actually Paninian linguist. That we don't know.
Okay, I know a little bit about this story. In fact, I wrote an essay on
Oh yeah, you
Mendeleev's
did, please.
periodic table 20 years ago. So I'm quite familiar with the whole story.
Oh yeah.
And I do know that Paul Kiparsky, and he does refer to my work as well in a Scientific American paper that he wrote with a student of his. He thinks that Panini's grammar may have had a hand, but personally, I don't think we need to go that far because Mendeleev himself was not a Sanskritist, but at St. Petersburg, there was a lot of Sanskrit being done at that time. So he knew about what was going on, and he knew that the Sanskrit Varnamala is a two-dimensional table. And that was the clinching idea. It's a two-dimensional table. How do you put the elements that you have, the chemical elements, in a form so that they make sense? And that's where he got this idea. And he predicted 3 or 4 different elements that he gave the names Ekam, Dutiyam, or Tritiyam, so and so. So he
Oh,
did give Sanskrit names, and they were eventually discovered, which is what made the world accept the Mendeleev's table chemistry and brought about a revolution. So this is the third element. I already talked about quantum mechanics. I talked about the scientific revolution, the infinite series, the Kerala School of Mathematics. I talked about mathematical logic, even chemistry. Look at this. And then there's something even more fascinating. According to biologists, the total number of species on Earth is about 8.4 million. And the various shastras, now this is not a well integrated shastric tradition. Shastras are where you use tarka to expand an inquiry. They're absolutely logical. Shastra is sciences. We should accept them. There's nothing about any random belief there. So it's generally believed in the Indian tradition. Now I can't recall the specific text that the total number of species on Earth or yonis on Earth is 84 lakh in Hindi, which is 8.4 million. And now there have been articles about 8.4 or 8.7 in Western tradition. And now some people are saying that maybe it's 10 million. But in any event, the mind, all of that we know about reality. Now, sitting in 2023, everything that we know of medicine, of cosmology, of computer science and physics and social sciences and history exists in our consciousness. Everything else, when we close our eyes, goes away. The only reality is consciousness, right? Aham Brahmasmi. That's one of the starting Mahavakyas, right? Aham Brahmasmi. That Aham, me, my consciousness is the entire cosmos. Just incredible. The whole Indian knowledge system, that's the term we are using, it's really universal. It's Sanatan. It's eternal. We need to embrace it. First of all, we need to honor it. If we honor it, then the goddess will smile at us, and then the goddess will empower us. What we did was, after 1947, we banished the goddess, Saraswati, and Durga, and Lakshmi. So we became poor. We became more and more poor. And fortunately, that is changing now.
so so many. This is so exciting. Because, I'll give you one short anecdote. When my own personal, when I was practicing medicine under one of my professors who would do acupuncture. Apart from, she's Western trained. She's part of the family medicine residency here. Dr. Mary Ann Burns. She would do acupuncture, and she would also use Indian system of chakra balancing and things like that. So I asked her one day, why do you mix Chinese traditional medicine with Ayurvedic concepts? Patients love what she does. They get better, they feel better, and all that. And she told me, Rajiv, don't you know, you're from India, that Indian science was the mother of all sciences. And from there, science traveled and got adapted in its own form in different countries. It went to China and it took it a different form. They owned it. but it was Indian science that they owned it. It went to so many places. It went to the west, it went to the east, it kind of traveled around. They owned it. They don't give credit, but this is the mother, this is the cradle of science. And this was many years ago. So that was an eye opener for me, that I was thinking, oh, acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine is different, and Ayurvedic system is different, and Western science. These are all like different forms of something that was more universal. And you take pieces of it, you become specialized in it.
True. You have 107 marmas in Ayurveda. And you know why we're 107? We talked about 108,
Yes.
the distance to the sun. If you take 108 pieces, the points at which they will come together will be 107, the weak spots, the marmas, right? Now, we have evidence of from the Kushan period onwards, Charak Samhita and the followers, how Indian medicine went to Tibet, went to China, and for 1,000 years, from the Kushan times or prior, even the Maurya times, until about 1,000, the greatest thing happening in the world was these scholars from India taking their Sanskrit texts, going to Central Asia, translating them into Chinese. And in fact, those translations are still chanted. And Indians don't know that in Chinese Buddhist temples in China, Japan, and Vietnam, and other countries, even now, every night, one of the most popular dharani, just as we have stotra in the Sanatan tradition, in the Buddhist tradition, they use the term dharani, which forms the basis, dharan, that you do dharan to. The most famous dharani is called Nilakantha dharani. In this Nilakantha dharani, which is in Sanskrit, they are chanting it without knowing what the meaning is, although scholars know what the meaning is. They are chanting in this Nilakantha dharani Avalokiteshvara, which is one of the bodhisattvas, who's really the deity of the Chinese Buddhism, generally in the female form, Guan Yin, and they have huge images to Guan Yin. But in this Nilakantha dharani, Avalokiteshvara actually praises Nilakantha, Shiva, and he says, you who swallowed the halal poison to save the universe are the greatest exemplar of compassion. Just imagine.
This is the translation.
Yeah, this is the translation. This is amazing. He also, Avalokiteshvara also praises Harihara. So in other words, they were all aware of this. We have suffered through what is called Smriti Nasha in the last 75 years. We have lost all this. But fortunately, it's really never been lost, because as somebody was telling me that the Raj Parampara, Raj Vansha in Bharat may have been interrupted, let's say in 1565 when the Vijayanagara Empire collapsed. But the Rishi Vansha has never been interrupted. Rishis have always lived in India in all corners, and they have safeguarded this most extraordinary knowledge. In my view, as someone who spent decades doing the Vedas and also doing the sciences, and I think if I've done something interesting in the sciences is because of what I had really learned in the Vedas, in the Shastras. I think it's the most extraordinary thing, and the time has come, especially now, when the world is facing a crisis of jobs, demographic crisis. The populations are going to shrink. According to many scholars, the world population might collapse to 1 billion from 8 billion right now in the next 100 years, because people are not needed. Robots are going to be doing everything. Computers are going to be doing everything, where we used to keep these ledgers and put information that cannot be done much more efficiently by computers. So this will be the time where all this extraordinary wisdom of the Vedas will be ready for the entire humanity to adopt and become a part of.
Yeah, so that is great. One of the things that the way I look at it from my limited perspective is India needs to Indian Sanatana Dharma, the land of India has to raise its the poverty has to come down. Where people have to feel that, because when you're with a hungry stomach, you can't really spend much time on the intellectual. You can't spend much time on intellectual achievement. So you have to feed your kids, you have to feed your family, you have to have a shelter. So as the GDP raises, as the India's level of economy raises, I think there will be free time for more people from India to spend more time on our intellectual, because the last 75 years, we spent a lot in poverty. A lot of Indians, spend their times making their ends meet. So I think that has to be the number one priority. I'm sure you are in the Prime Minister's Advisory Council, so they are probably looking at, unless we raise the economy, we can at the same time work on the intellectual property of India.
But Rajiv, that is happening. India is right now in GDP terms third largest, PPP. It's supposed to be second largest in the next 10 years. Right now it's China, US, India. It'll be China, India, US in 1935 or so. And India's is supposed or expected to overtake China's also. Until 1100 or 1000, India was 45% of the world economy. If it reaches even 15, 16, 20%, 15%, India will be a totally different place. And we see this already in India. The youth in India are so much more confident. And look at the new movies that have been made, not sadly in Bollywood, because that's stuck to just mindless mimicry of the Western genre movies, but certainly in the Telugu cinema, for example, there is much more self-confidence. People have to connect back, and there is so much that one can learn, and not just for philosophy. Ultimately, as Krishna says, yoga karmasu kaushalam. We need yoga to finally find excellence in whatever action we are doing. Even if we are craftsmen, we are working wherever, that devotion to excellence that we see, for example, in Japan. When you travel to Japan, you're very pleased that, hey, these people do their job as well as ought to be done. And that's what we have to discover. Philosophy, I think we have safeguarded. We have had great rishis, even in recent times, all over in Andhra, in Tamil Nadu, in Karnataka, everywhere, North India as well. So we have had thinkers and rishis. We need all this wisdom to be embraced by every man.
Yeah. And I think it's already.
It is happening. It is happening. Yes.
Yeah. Especially people like expats, like you and me going. Obviously, when you're here, you get more time. At least I do get more time. Despite the busy full-time schedule, I still get more time to work on, do a master's in Sanskrit and so on. So that is great. So there's one thing that bothers me when it comes to adopting Sanskrit is when you look at Sanskrit. Let us say you are learning with bhaktis. Rama, Ramo, Rama, He Rama, He Ramo, He Rama, Ramam, Ramo, Rama. That is where, if you want non-Hindus also learn Sanskrit, because there is wisdom in it. It has to transcend the boundaries of religion, faith, and everything. You want more people to embrace it. I don't know how Germans are doing it. Maybe because the Germans and other Western Indologists, they have owned it. How do you convince people to study Rama, Ramo, Rama? How do you tell Muslim to say Rama, Rama, Rama?
Well, you know what? Most of us learned languages without even learning grammar. I can tell you, I never learned the English language. I grew up in small villages in Kashmir, We went to schools where we used to sit on the floor, and our teachers almost probably didn't know very much. But how do we learn a language? How do we learn our mother tongue? We hear it from our mother and we are
By
immersed in it.
immersion.
Immersion. And that's how Sanskrit must be spread once again, through immersion. Everybody is learning English through immersion, right? And of course, you can also correct yourself. You can use the
Yeah.
internet. You can see, hey, I made this construction. Is it correct? So easy. So immersion, and fortunately now on Google Translate, we also have a Sanskrit translate
Right.
opportunity. So you can take any English and you can see what the corresponding to Sanskrit is. So I think the time has come for us, of course, also to learn it the formal grammar way for those who want to be experts at grammar, but really make the vast majority of people learn Sanskrit through immersion. I personally think that going back to Sanskrit would be of extraordinary importance and significance to Indians for a variety of reasons. And I mentioned that I wrote a little column on that some time ago.
Right.
The case
5
for
reasons
Sanskrit.
why Sanskrit.
Yeah, right. So one of these is the Sanskrit effect. Doctors have discovered, neuroscientists have discovered that if you do Sanskrit, your cortex does increase, your brain does actually expand or enlarge. And why does it do it? Because Sanskrit requires a certain discipline. Now, that's one. Learning the grammar requires a certain discipline. Second, Sanskrit opens up one's little c into the possibilities of big C. Normally, what are we doing? How do we spend our time? Just getting absorbed, engaging our indriyas into some activity like watching TV. So your mind is passive. It's your indriyas who are interacting with the environment, right?
Right.
But if
sensory stimulation.
But if you can do Sanskrit, and reflect on the Mahavakyas or the Subhashitani and so on, it opens up your mind to possibilities, so that you can go beyond just the Annamaya and the Pranamaya and the Manomaya koshas. And the Manomaya koshas are where most people are stuck, because Manomaya kosha is where Tejas, Tanmatra, forms. People are stuck in forms. Why is America going crazy right now? So many people, maybe 100 years ago, 1 in 1,000 wanted to change their sex. Now, why are 10 in 100 in certain elite colleges wanting to change their sex? Because they're stuck in the Manomaya kosha, in the Tejas Tanmatra.
A lot of them in Annamaya kosha.
Or Annamaya kosha. And so they have been told there's nothing beyond Manomaya kosha. They don't know about the Vijnanamaya kosha and the Anandamaya kosha. They only get certain flashes of it, and so they are lost. I think the West is in horribly dangerous situation. It's in a crisis point right now. And what can save them is expansion of their consciousness through this universal knowledge. Sanatan knowledge is universal knowledge. It is the knowledge, it's Atma Vidya. It's for everybody. And until now, many cultures have been happy to live in little c plus stories, their own stories. And stories are charming and comforting, right? But this possibility of big C is going to be the next big revolution in the world, in my view.
This is amazing. So what is more amazing is that you are a scientist. You are a computational, you are a quantum mechanics scientist. You have done a lot of work on neural networks and things like that. Most people think that when they're in this one path, they're stuck in that path, and then they can't touch anything else. Like they can't go to their roots and start studying or understanding other roots. In fact, one of the cardiologists told me that all your time, your energies are spent in it. You don't have any psychic energy left to do anything else. How did you manage to do so much in such a short time? I mean, you might think that, oh, I spent 5 decades or 6 decades in it, but that is still a short time compared to how much literature you have produced. Most people spend on one short thing, and which is good. Vivekananda says, pick up one idea, spend all your energies on just that one idea. But then there is this possibility that people like you show others that there is more that you can do. How so you mentioned briefly that you grew up in a small village in Kashmir, going to small schools, and here you are in Prime Minister's office in the United States, in America, and many places. You're all over, helping others understand about Vedic and science. Tell us your story very briefly.
Okay. Well, firstly, let me tell you this whole thing about exhaustion doing whatever work one is doing. And it is exhausting. It is exhausting because the modern profession forces you to be stuck in that Manomaya kosha. And in Manomaya kosha, we are all like auto mechanics. We have to do it. You are a surgeon, you have to do the same thing again and again. You are doing the same equations day after day after day. And each one of them sort of constricts your vision. Where one has to go and where modern education has failed is to give the glimpse of the higher koshas, of that light from the Atman, which filters through the Anandamaya kosha and the Vijnanamaya kosha. And it does filter through also to the Manomaya kosha to a certain extent. But if people could see the beauty of the light in the other koshas, it'll be self-transforming. And that's what makes you come alive once again. Then all the tiredness is gone. The tiredness is gone because you're stuck in the images. That is like Vaikari of Bhartrihari. So absolutely. So this is it. I think that's where, I think I was lucky that I didn't really have a proper formal high school education. I mean, I went to schools and they were teachers. We didn't do very much because these were really, very bad schools in small villages, not just ones down. My father was a veterinarian. But my father, before he had gotten married, he wanted to be a yogi. He was a very, had taken a vow that he will become a yogi. So he had been an apprentice to a yogi. And then at the end of that apprenticeship, his guru told him that, no, go ahead, go to the world and get married and so on. So he was a very profoundly wise man. And so we had the right inputs coming in from home. But in reality, and then I did my PhD, there was no coursework. So I was sort of free. And I always believed in this, that first of all people are the same. We have the indriyas, we have the senses. All of us have the same senses. Then why is that one person is able to do more than somebody else? Just because of clarity within. And that's what yoga is all about. I think our beautiful yoga tradition, Krishna speaks about karma yoga and bhakti yoga and other yogas, right? Jnana yoga and so on. So all those yogas and the other various sadhanas in principle provide us ways of doing that anavaran, that uncovering of that light, which we are preventing from falling onto our antahakaran. If we allow that light to fall on our antahakaran, suddenly you become an instrument of the devas. Do you see that? Then it's not your ahankar, the light falls on the light is obstructed from the antahakaran by ahankar. Ahankar is like a dark shadow. If you can get rid of your ahankar, if you truly believe that you are just a instrument, a nimitta matra of a larger current, as Kena Upanishad says, he who thinks he knows not, because that's where the ahankar comes in. The moment you let go and just become an instrument, then all those results come to you from nowhere. They come, it's like Srinivas Ramanujan. he was, he was a good man. He was a truly open man. And so the goddess smiled on him. And I think the goddess is there to do anugraha to every human being. But we need to reduce our personal ego and really, in submission, let pray and to the goddess. They're within us. You do Sri Vidya, everything is within us. The goddesses are within us as our teachers. So I truly believe, anybody can do anything. And this is another way, another place where all this wisdom is so important. When I was growing up, my father, for example, told me any child can do anything if they were to apply themselves to it. One of the tragedies of America and the West is that in the middle school, these kids are told by the counselors, well, you can only do this. You can only be a marketer. You can only hope to do this because you have done only this good in your courses. I think that's destructive. That is hurting these children. And some of these children end up doing bad things to themselves because their confidence in themselves has been compromised.
Yes. So this expansion in I think your father already had this expanded consciousness. I think that is where his wisdom kind of passed on. And of course, this session is one of the best sessions I ever had in this conversations. It is almost like a guru imparting the wisdom through osmosis. So I think we have reached the end of this episode. So Dr. Kak, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. I hope more people watch this because each part of what you mentioned, it's only a fragment of wisdom that you have given us. You can take a little bit of it and expand and make it, like you have written 20 books. So you can expand that and have another session on it. So thank you so much for taking your time, giving us the wisdom. I hope you continue this path and enlighten and give, the prakasha to more people. Especially people in India also need more help because they think that everything that the West does is great. Everything that we do is subpar or it doesn't have much value. When they're actually like beggars sitting on a great wealth. They just don't have the key. Most of them, they just forgot, they lost their key, or they had the key and don't know where to search. So I hope that these people like you, continue to enlighten and provide your wisdom.
Thank you, Rajiv. Really enjoyed being part of your show.